housekeeping. If you are here to learn or relearn, as Amber said, to be a good ally, you have clicked on the right page. However, if you're here for a tutorial, sorry guys, it's my dog. If you're here for a tutorial for maybe like baking bread or makeup tips, this is the wrong link and you may want to step out, but I would love for you to stay because I think that we're going to have a really, really good conversation that is going to benefit us all. To kick off tonight's panel, I'd like to give a huge shout out again to the Diversity Committee of the South Carolina Bar for giving us this forum to continue these type of conversations. Special shout out to Miss Amber Hendricks. This is the brainchild behind this. And we would not be here without her idea of this being a topic that we need to discuss. For those who do not know, my name is Leslie Simpson, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's panel, appropriately titled, To Be or Not to Be a Good Ally. Just a little background about the interesting people that you will hear from tonight. I'll start with myself because I'm probably the least important on this lovely panel. Again, my name is Leslie Simpson. I'm currently working for the South Carolina Association of Counties as a lawyer lobbyist. And I serve on several diversity committees with the South Carolina Bar by choice and by outside forces. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that later on. I'm also a cheerleading coach at Claflin University. So if in case you would like to see a cheer later on, I will not do it, but just if that's something you're interested in, if that catches your attention, that I could see if I can try to do something for you. But we're going to go in alphabetical order of our panelists. First up, we have Mr. Sidney Evering, who is currently an attorney in Columbia, South Carolina at Parker Poe. Sidney, who is a two-time USC graduate, go Cox, practices in the areas of public finance, economic development, and local government. He is the former director of diversity at Parker Poe. Sidney, how about you tell us a little bit about your work or your most memorable moments as the director of diversity?
Sure. So I served as the director of diversity and inclusion at the firm for about 7.5 years, at which time I was responsible for helping develop and implement diversity initiatives. Some of you might be aware of what I would say is the crown jewel of our diversity initiative. 7.5 years is the Life in a Law Firm program that the name is subsequently changed to Thrive, but it's a full day symposium for minority law students from across the Carolinas. Some people came as far away as Alabama and Georgia, but we would basically provide a symposium where law students can come in, meet practicing attorneys of color, learn what it's like to practice in a mid-sized major law firm, answer any questions that they might have, mock interviews, just kind of really an all-day program that I think was really impactful and really helpful for up-and-coming law students. And so I also was responsible for just retention. I spent a lot of time with our lawyers of color, making sure that they were given the opportunities they needed to succeed. Put together social events with our lawyers of color and firm leadership to make sure that they got to know each other on a personal level. So it was a good, fruitful 7.5 years, and I decided to pass the baton a couple years ago. So
that is very interesting, and I know that you will offer a important perspective in our discussion this evening. But next, we will go to Leah Riesman. Ms. Reisman is a Tulane University graduate raised in South Carolina, and she is an addiction specialist in New Orleans, Louisiana. As a licensed master social worker, Lee has dedicated her efforts tirelessly to social justice. Lee, how about you tell us briefly about your social justice work?
Yeah, First of all, I just want to say thank you to all the people who have organized this. I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation, and also thank you to all the people who are joining in and taking that risk or that step to be a part of this conversation. But in terms of some of the work that I've done professionally as a social worker, I've provided direct services now in New Orleans for almost a decade. It's crazy to say. But everything from homelessness to addiction, mental health, client services for incarcerated individuals, the list kind of goes on. And then also in my personal life, I just try to ensure that not only professionally do I practice those things, but I embrace them in my personal life as well.
Well, I know that you will also offer some really good perspective to this discussion. So I'm getting, the excitement is building. I hope the excitement is building for everyone else. And now rounding out the dynamic trio is Meghan Simmons, who is originally from South Carolina, currently residing in DC, who is the senior policy attorney for Ujima Incorporated, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community, which serves as a national culturally specific services issue resource center to provide support for the Black community. Meghan, how about you tell us a little bit more about your policy work?
Hi, thanks so much for having me and inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'm really excited about all the things I'm going to learn, as well as some of the things we're going to be able to share with all of you out there. Like you shared, I'm a senior policy attorney at Ujima Inc. I spend my time advocating and educating for policy, specifically regarding interpersonal violence against women of Black women or women of the African diaspora, which includes African American women, the Afro-Latina community, as well as Afro-Latina, community, as well as the African immigrant community. Some of the things that I spent a lot of my time with are Black maternal health and the disparity as it relates to specifically Black women. I also spent a lot of time with the Crown Act, which is policy that surrounds specifically Black women's hair or Black people's hair in the workplace, making sure that folks aren't being discriminated against as it relates to hair and employment opportunities, and several other things to include housing and economic concerns.
Well, I hope, again, that y'all are excited, because we have some panelists that have a breadth of knowledge. I do want to make sure that I give a slight trigger warning. Although we are sharing our opinions and we're having this open discussion that may make you feel a little uncomfortable, which should certainly be okay, we do want to say that we are not experts in the field. Hopefully, tonight will allow you to start these conversations, or even to know how to start these conversations about this very important issue. And I guess you're asking, well, what exactly is the issue? There's several issues facing us right now. Systematic racism, racial disparities in every facet of today's society, bigotry, police brutality that's resulting in senseless deaths. I could go on all night, on and on and on about the issues that are facing us. However, tonight we're going to take a little time and be focused on self-evaluation. We also would like to say, although as a panel and as the diversity community, that we understand that minority groups run the gamut. And we understand that race is not always the biggest issue, but this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. But to know that any recommendations or pieces of advice that you will possibly hear, that you can take back to your own respective lives and use that for any issues dealing with women, any issues dealing with the LGBTQ community, any issues dealing with veterans, any issues dealing with people with disabilities. You will be able to take this advice back and hopefully have those conversations as well. But to kick off this discussion, the title of this panel discussion may have caught your eye, because if you're white, you kind of want to know how to be an ally. You want to know how to support your Black friends. You want to know what are the right and wrong ways to say certain things. And if you're Black, you really want to know, well, you know, how are they making the effort, or how should they be making the effort? And how do I take this as genuine? And ironically, the word that we used is ally. And as a panel, we've had a couple of discussions about whether or not that is the right word to use. More specifically, there have been some discussions that say that ally may be outdated. Maybe it is an empty buzzword that places of employment, or it's easy or a popular word to say because it's kind of like ally. But there have been some other words, comrade, accomplice, advocate. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and we're going to start, since Sidney started first, we're going to start with Meghan. What is your take on using the word ally, and do you believe that there is a better word to use, and why?
I think people get to choose what kind of language they want to use. I do think the word ally is trending, and it is used very loosely. When I think of what allyships mean to me, they're actionable, and that means that when you see something, say something. And for example, if you know that you work in an HR department and you know that there are certain names that are disregarded because they are likened with certain communities, or if you are in a position to assist someone in helping them to put themselves in a better position to do better at work, you know, those things are true allyship, supporting those initiatives in an active way, not simply, you know, liking things, which is fine. I'm not saying that that's problematic, but I think it's hard for me to see someone as an ally if they allow things to go on that they know are racist, that they have seen biases in their own lives, to include their professional as well as personal lives, and then identify and say that they're an ally. Now, they can call themselves an accomplice or a comrade or an ally, all of the above. I think they get to decide that for themselves. But to me, true allyship is a verb, and you live that.
And Lee, what about you? What is your take on the word ally? I know that when we were discussing, you actually sent us some definitions of the word. And I believe that you think that there's a better term that needs to be used the same way I think all of us are thinking now about action items. What is your take?
Yeah, well, I agree with Meghan quite a bit. I don't know that there's a better word. Something I've been thinking about actually today is, you know, I don't go out in public and identify myself as an ally, right? It's more of other people identifying that white person, right? So for me, it's coming down to semantics, and like it's almost redirecting the conversation from what should be happening and the actions we should be taking to, wait, what's my identity? Like, I just don't know that that's really, at least for myself, it's not a priority. So people can call me a social worker, they could call me an advocate, they could call me an ally.
Right.
It really, you know, we define ourselves by our character and our actions.
What's your take, Sidney?
Yeah, I totally agree with Leah and Meghan. I don't think we need to get caught in the semantics, but I do agree with what Meghan said initially, that there needs to be some action behind the label. You know, I kind of look at it as someone who's an active supporter of a Black person, or active supporter in terms of eliminating systemic racism. So whatever steps or actions that might entail, there just needs to be some action behind the support. It just can't be you're an ally in principle or a supporter in principle, because that's just being passive. And when we allow ourselves to be passive, then things continue to go down a lot of times.
I think you all bring up a very, very good point about the term itself is whatever you call yourself is what you're to call yourself. It's the action is what's important, which leads perfectly into my next question about, or the topic about performative action and authentic actions. And if I can expound upon that for our watchers, when we talk about performative actions, you see a lot of companies coming out with these statements. We support Black lives. You see different cities painting Black lives on the road. You see people are changing the names of streets. They want the Confederate flag to come down. One of the questions or one of the comments that came to me was, they're doing all of these pretty things, but they're not really doing anything. And so I think to internalize that, so that our white allies or people in general understand what we mean by action, we need to clarify what's performative in nature and what's an actual authentic action that is going to make some change. And Sidney, what is your position about what are good acts or good things, or how you start to make so that you're not just performative, you're not just a surface level actor, but you're actually doing something that's making some change?
Yeah, I think that can, that can be across the gamut. I mean, it could be something that's really huge, that's going to affect a lot of people, or it could just be you taking time to have a vested interest in one person and a vested interest in that one person's success. So I don't think there's a real definition or a real one particular action that you can take that's going to, label you as a performative supporter. But I think it needs to be something that's going to improve opportunity for fairness and equity, just improve a person's life. It's not, like you said, just to be flowery, having statements on a website. Yeah, that we appreciate that, but that's not really doing anything other than just kind of saying, you raising your hand and saying, we support Black Lives Matter, or whatever it may be. But what are you doing behind the scenes in terms of your hiring practices or retention practices, things like that? Or are you having programs in place that are going to help minority and your Black employees climb the ladder of success? So there needs to be like a vested interest in helping people to succeed.
Megan, what is your outlook on performative versus actual action?
I mean, very similar to what has already been said. Again, it's wonderful to have these statements, but when you look at the stats and we understand who sits in what these C-suites look like, and there are no minorities to include Black people, there are no women, but then you have these wonderful statements saying how you support Black life. It's just contradictory. Doing things to support policy that is helpful, my wheelhouse, doing things that will support policy, even that will be helpful to your to the folks that work with and for you, particularly when if most of them are Black. There are industries wherein overwhelmingly you see Black people or people of color doing things that will be helpful if you're really committed to inclusion, if you're really committed to making life better and making it more equitable for Black people.
Lee, what have you seen from, and I say your counterparts because let's face it, you are the only white person on the panel, but what do you see that other white people are doing that is performative in nature that you wish they would stop?
I'm not going to say I wish people would stop, because I think it's the first step to a process. And so I think it's somewhere that they can start digging a little deeper in. And so a word that comes to mind as we're having this conversation is anti-racist. And that anti-racism is actively addressing racism, not only in your environment, your workplace, your community, but also within yourself. So I think for white people specifically, taking that time to really process, what are my biases? Where's my perspective off? Educating ourselves, acknowledging our own privilege, and understanding how to use that as a benefit. So those, it's like they're trying, it's the trendy thing. And I think that's part of the reason why we're questioning the word ally, because it's trending, right? But in every trend, we could, somebody has the opportunity then to do more. So I just encourage people around me to really dive into themselves and start working on themselves before taking those actions outward.
Yes, and that takes me again, and y'all, we practice this, but we didn't practice it this well because it's just leading into all of the next questions. I think so we talked about the label, we talked a little bit about the actions, and of course we need to keep talking about which actions need to be taken. But I think one of the big issues is how people view racism. I was reading an article to where that was written by a white woman that said, a lot of my white friends view racism as hate crimes, white supremacy, KKK, because I don't say the N-word. I don't believe in hate crimes. I don't believe in white supremacy. I have Black friends. I'm married to a Black man, or I have a black child that in itself that they're not racist. But then the other part of it is that racism has different forms, and I'm not sure if it rises to the level of being racist, but maybe goes into the biases that you may have. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more on understanding or evaluating, and I'll have to start with you, Lee, how you evaluate to see where it is to where you're not racist, or how you can identify those certain things, because I think that's a lot. It's hard for people to handle, because they just think about racism as being the hate crimes and white supremacy, and because that's not them, they're not racist.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and there's various forms of racism. I think the place to start is to acknowledge that the system that we live in, our society is systematically racist, right? And so in some ways we are all perpetuating that, right? And so that's a hard thing to damn, that hurts, However, when we are able to acknowledge and identify those points is then where we can address those issues in our own life. So I definitely think there is overt racism, like hate crimes, and clearly this is racist behavior, but then there's also covert racism. And this is where I think it's really important for us to be mindful of our language, and sometimes shift our language when we're having conversations to ensure that it's not perpetuating not just a racist kind of underlying tone, but also belittling or patronizing Black community. Another phrase like the white savior complex, right? I see this quite a bit in my own profession in social work, where it's this helper coming in with all the best intentions, right? They want to help people, but in the midst of helping them, they're also perpetuating racist ideas. So Black people aren't able to get out of communities, because of this system, or, justifying, a young Black male's journey into incarceration and making it seem okay because they could understand his background and his struggles and all these things. But at the same time, it's just cycling those same ideas.
Meghan, what is your standpoint?
I think there just needs to be a long-term commitment to learning, changing, be willing to read, watch, listen, and know that, you know, it's a lifelong process. You know, I don't think and say some of the same things that I thought and said 5 or 6 years ago. And hopefully, you know, if I have done or said, you know, social media gets people caught up a lot. We see that oftentimes where people, you know, engage in cancel culture, and it's like, you know, 10 years ago you said XYZ, now you're, well, people change, people do change their perspective. Just be willing to be accountable, move on, and say, I've learned from that and I'm not that person anymore, or I've changed. But just being willing to acknowledge and being willing to understand that, being willing to acknowledge, being willing to listen, not patronizing folks. If they're saying these things are happening, don't disregard it or try to minimize it or try to provide them with an example of why this is not, in fact, happening to them. I think those are some things that would be helpful.
Sidney, in listening to Lee and Meghan, one of the things it just strikes me, still talking about racism, is although we want them to learn and grow and understand that certain things that may have good intentions have wrong intentions, as a Black male, how do you feel, like, how do you think that white people get to understand these type of things? Is it our responsibility to be the teachers or be the voice in the room that you know, smooths their feelings a little bit to how do we get there? How do we assist white people to get there to that point to where they're learning from the growth, or that they learn that their actions have unintended consequences?
Now, to answer your initial question, no, I do not think it's Black people's responsibility to do that. I mean, if a Black person chooses to do that, then that's fine. But I kind of wanted to back up a little bit and touch upon something that Lee said in terms of our society being systemically racist. Because as I see this, and it took me a while to kind of connect the dots and get here, but you know, I see American society kind of people being in one of 3 buckets. It's almost like a bell curve. You have your racists, your staunch racists, your card-carrying KKK members, and you know, and then your bell curve starts to take shape, and then you have a lot of non-racists, like in the middle, and then you have your anti-racists and people who are actively working to you know, eliminate systemic racism. But the problem with the people who are in the middle, the non-racists, which I think probably are the majority of people, they all have these implicit biases, and because American society is racist, those implicit biases tend to negatively impact Black people. So you already have these negative thoughts and perceptions because you've been programmed from day one, when you're born into this country, to this society, that Black people are negative. And whether you think it consciously, most people don't even consciously think about it, but they react in a way that confirms that this unconscious belief. And you see it in studies all the time. And I remember the study about little Black girls. They automatically choose a white doll as the pretty doll or the nice, you know, doll, because they're ingrained from day one that Black is bad or Black is negative. You see the inherent fear of young Black men. And so the issue is for white Americans, white people in general, just to understand that they have these implicit biases and they can manifest themselves in racist ways. Because it took me a while, because a white person would do something that I see as racist, or I feel as racist, and that white person would think to themselves, I hadn't done anything racist. I'm not a racist. How dare you call me a racist? And really in their mind, they're not a racist because they haven't given it any pre-thought. But it's the implicit bias that they have, that their actions manifest in racist ways. And so they really have to step back and do the work and realize that, like, this society is racist. We have to deprogram ourselves from thinking about Black people the way we do.
And I think that is a good point, because we can have all the implicit bias trainings to run the gamut. There are people who make their livelihood off of having these type of trainings. But I see in the comments, because I am watching y'all, and there is a good point that, people will download apps and read books before going to a foreign country so that they are not to offend that culture. And that is the very first thing that they think, because I don't want to insult I don't want to make anyone upset. I think that same, and I agree with our audience that should be the same type of mentality. So although we are talking about this issue, I do want to make sure that we're giving our viewers who are really searching and grasping for what I need to do. I think you need to approach it in that same type of way. I know there are some books that are circulating around now, and I know we all know of these books. There's the gamut of, it seems like the anti-racist books that everyone has been reading. And I think, yes, I'm very glad that people are taking the time out to read up on things that they never knew about before. You have people who are not, didn't know about the Tulsa Massacre, who did not know, things that as Black people, we just automatically know, but they just don't know, and they're reading them now. And I think they need to take that same type of effort to learn how to interact with people who do not look like them the same way that they do when they go overseas, when they go to France, or they go even to Africa. Even when they go to Africa, they try to learn, what is the best way to not insult the culture, which is...
They have the privilege of being apathetic is
yes.
What it amounts to. And for years, they've never had to learn about a different culture because, American culture has been set up a certain way.
And so that takes me into, and I guess it's more about the actions, because the questions that I've received, I've tried to put them in some categories. And since we're talking about these actions and identifying these racist ideals that you may did not know that you had because you grew up around these things all your life. Do you think, where is, so let's say you've read a book. I'm a white person and I've read this amazing book and it makes me feel like I've learned so much from it. How do they then, because I know a lot of, and that I've received, people want to have these conversations. They want to have the conversations to be like, did I read this right? I want to talk about it, but I don't want to be insulting. Like even before reading the books, I want to talk about this issue. I want to talk about George Floyd. I want to talk about Breonna Taylor. I want to talk about, this racial trauma that y'all experience on a daily basis, but I don't know how to do it. How do you think is there a non-offensive way to do it? And if so, or if not, how do you have these conversations? How do you start these conversations?
I think proceed with. Oh, did you say Megan? I just want to make sure. Okay. I think you should proceed with caution. I think you should identify what your intent. When a lot of what is going on in the current climate started happening just a few weeks ago, a lot of my Black female friends called and said, all of my white friends are calling and they want me to console them. Mm-hmm. And I can't console them right now because apart from the pandemic that I'm going through, apart from homeschooling my kids and figuring out this whole work from home situation, I can't deal with what I've been living for the entirety of my life and try to explain that to them and make them feel okay because I just have too much. I think you have to make sure that you understand that, this is a very traumatic time for folks. And, having these conversations can be traumatic. And so you may not get the response that you may want. Now, there are going to be folks that are going to engage you, particularly your friends. You know, you can have courageous conversations with your friends, and those are likely safe spaces where you can ask the questions that you haven't been able to ask. And of course, in friendships, we always assume good intent. So but just be mindful that that might not be a good time, particularly with all that is going on. That said, don't expect this person, in whatever capacity that you know them, to do the work for you. And what I mean by that specifically is be willing to, listen, be willing to, some of the things that we've already talked about, be willing to read those big books, be willing to have some deep dives and have some real educating and re-educating of yourself as far as the foundation of this country and what Black people have been living.
Sidney, have you run into, because I know, like Meghan, I've had an influx, and I don't, at the very beginning, it was very like, I'm tired. I don't have time to coddle you and to console you. But at the same time, it's like, I understand we need to have that conversation, because how else are you going to know? As a Black male, are you having, or have you had those same conversations?
I have had a few conversations, and I guess for me personally, it's been cathartic because I was able to get it off my chest.
Mm.
I could be, everybody's different. Like, some people don't want to talk about it at all. Some people don't want to be bothered by it. It's just too emotionally, like Meghan said, traumatizing. I get that. There were points, especially immediately following George Floyd's killing, that I didn't want to discuss it. I was upset. I was angry. But as I started to process it more, I wanted to get it off my chest with someone other than, my wife, my family, my friends. I wanted to be able to talk with a white person to let them know, like this is what we've been facing forever. This is not anything new. And to me, that's what is so frustrating, is because, it's because of the advent of, or the ubiquity of cell phones, cameras now, that you're seeing all of these incidents, in video. But these are the things that Black communities have been dealing with forever, like I said. And so that's the frustrating part. But when I'm able to speak to my white friends and colleagues about it, it is a cathartic for me, because I'm hoping that I'm able to convey, what we've been feeling.
Leah, did you have any of these conversations?
Yeah, well, I mean, I live in a predominantly Black community. A lot of my closest friends are Black. So, something Meghan was saying is, basically being able to find that safe space of peers or friends that you can risk, saying the wrong thing and being corrected. My thoughts right now are just that, well, first of all, having that sense of insecurity is a positive sign, because it's self-reflective. It's basically acknowledging, I don't know. I could be wrong. I'm not sure how to communicate. And so again, I think that's a first step to those conversations and a willingness to grow. But it should definitely not be said, right? So you read all this information, the next thing naturally to do is talk about it. So I think it's really important to find those safe spaces that you can really learn. You feel comfortable learning from your peers. Actively listening is a word that's come up quite a bit, and it's hard for me to do, I'll say, but really just listening without interrupting anybody, without trying to defend yourself or myself, or disprove, or say, or identify how I'm different. Rather just really, really listen and take that information in, let it soak in. Another thought that I'm having is this concept, or this idea of white shame or white guilt. And kind of like the title, or identifying ally versus other words, a semantic, it almost seems again like a redirection of attention, right? It's like, oh, the white, I'm uncomfortable. Yeah, we all should be uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. This is the not even scratching the surface of discomfort. And so I think rather than feeling shame, we should reframe that into anger. and realize that it's the same kind of oppressive system that has brainwashed us in a lot of ways, and kept us blindfolded from the truth, from a lot of things. And so, yeah, it's just stepping stones, you know. It is uncomfortable, but it needs to be done.
I think we lost Leslie for a second, you guys. I don't know if y'all noticed that.
Yeah.
Okay. And then she mentioned that she was having some weather. Well,
I wanted to just follow up on what you said in terms of white people. And I think that could be a contributing factor to why people have not had these conversations in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, when you really delve into it, when you really, you know, when the rubber really meets the road, I mean, there have been some horrific things done to Black people in this country. I mean, if you just want to talk about lynchings, for example, I mean, it's just horrific. I mean, it's inhumane. And it's really difficult for people to come to terms with that, because it's almost like you're holding a mirror up to them. And of course, people will say, well, that wasn't me, you know, that I wasn't a part of that. And that's true in many cases, but it wasn't that long ago. I mean, you know, we're talking, you know, a generation ago for a lot of these incidents. And of course, what we're still dealing with to this day. And so people have to get past that shame, past that guilt, and be willing to have enough courage to have these conversations and be empathetic about it, and acknowledge the trauma that a lot of their Black friends and neighbors have experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good perspective, is in that it wasn't that long ago. It's interesting. I do a presentation where I present a slide, and, you know, of course, you know, you discuss slavery, which is like 4, and then you have Black clothes and, you know, segregation and all these things on up to the 60s. So, you know, we think about like voting rights and integration and all these things. Black people haven't actually been free in this country. It's only been about 53 years. And so, you know, my parent is, you know, not, is only like 60. And so, you know, when you put those kinds of things into perspective, and you're having conversations with people, you know, that are alive and well and living and working and, you know, governing themselves right around society, and they can have these discussions with you about things, that these horrific things that you talk about, and, you know, the lynchings and the marches, and, you know, and then we see how it impacts us. It continues to impact us. It's just very telling.
Yeah, and yeah, you're right. It continues to impact us because a lot of the vestiges are still having an effect to this day. I mean, you think about redlining and things that happened back, you know,
absolutely,
in the early 19th century, in the 30s and 40s, and how that that impacted Black Americans' ability to build wealth, because they couldn't buy couldn't get mortgage loans. And all of that stuff just kind of builds upon itself generation after generation, because, you know, like I think Lee said earlier, it's just systemic. It's been systemic since day one. This country was kind of founded for white men, property owners, you know, and, you know, women's suffrage, you know, we're talking about 100 years ago. I mean, so this is all in terms of time, just relatively recent. And we have Leslie back. We
hey,
tried to
Leslie.
for you, Leslie.
My computer must be delayed. I don't see her yet. I have one more thought as we're having this conversation. When I think about the concept or the idea of white shame, I'm realizing that that's also taking a sense of responsibility. It's like it's like, oh man, I was a part of this in some capacity, you know, and that sense of responsibility can again be reframed into a commitment to make changes. So, you know, I've heard or read a lot of conversations, or been in conversations where, you know, it's not just the responsibility of the Black community to make these changes. And
right.
So to transition that white shame to white responsibility of like, whoa, I have a vested interest in making these changes,
Right.
gives, you know, ownership into this fight.
Right.
Right.
just going to assume that y'all were having the conversation, and I hope that I'm not repeating, but the one thing that I was about to say before the internet cut off on me on some reason. I paid my bill, y'all, so don't think, I paid my bill, was something that was being talked about, that it was resonated with me about listening. I know that a lot of the friends that I have made mention about when they are talking to other people about it, that they make the issue about them. That they're like, well, while we understand that the issue is affecting you also, I don't know if it's appropriate for those discussions that I'm trying to explain to you exactly how I feel. If you come back at me, well, what about this? And it's, well, what about me type of situation. And how do you and I'll start with Sidney, because Sidney said that these conversations are cathartic. Are you running into, or have you had to where when you're having these conversations with people that they turn the focus on them? And if so, how are you able to turn it back to what the issue at hand is? And if not, how would you recommend that you handle those conversations?
Yeah, I've been, I guess, fortunate in that sense. No, I have not had conversations with anyone who tried to make it about them or, turn it into their own pity party. So, but I mean, if you do encounter that situation, that is really unfortunate. That would probably upset me, to be honest with you. I'm like, can we at least have a moment here? So, I guess to answer your question, how would I turn it or try to get it turned back? I would just say it,
Same. I'm like, well, I would just tell them, you're centering yourself, right?
Be upfront and just tell them, like, I get you might feel a certain type of way, but it's really not about you right now. I mean, the point of this conversation is for me to be able to express myself and get my feelings and emotions out. And I would appreciate it if you could just listen and, be with an empathetic ear.
Meghan, have you had any of these conversations to where that their intentions are good, but it turns into, what about me? Or it turns into a pity party? Have you had those situations?
I have, and it was what I considered at the time to be an unsafe environment, because I felt like this person, it was in a professional environment, and it was someone that she apparently thought we were friends. I regarded her more as a colleague, and she thought that we could have this interchange, and I was not comfortable, particularly in the workplace, because I didn't want to have to deal with any type of reprimands. I didn't want to lose my job at the time. That is important to me. It's still important to me and was important to me at that time. And so I didn't feel comfortable. So I did engage her, but I kind of kept it very generic. I didn't really necessarily share my own personal opinion, or it was just in general terms. There was not anything specific to me, because I didn't want that to then in turn be shared with, other people that I worked with. And then later on, suddenly I, just different microaggressions could occur, or you can have situations wherein, your eval didn't look the way, suddenly you're not as congenial with everyone as you want, so I, again, just to be honest, there are times where it is unsafe to have those conversations with folks, and people are going to survive. We have had to survive in some very uncomfortable situations, and I shouldn't say we, I should say I have had to survive in some very uncomfortable professional environments, and so I tread lightly, particularly in my professional life.
And Leslie, I will say this. I do want to say, I think there are times and there is a place to have conversations where you engage and go back and because I think that presents a learning opportunity. So, you know, if I'm talking with a white person who are telling me about the way they feel and the way they perceive things, that might be a learning opportunity for me. Maybe I can offer some information that might change their perspective. So there is a place for that. And I think we actually really should probably have more dialogue where we go back and forth, because so often we just kind of, you know, walk on eggshells and aren't willing to have those type of conversations and just sweep things under the rug. And then there's no progress because no one is courageous enough to have those conversations.
Agreed.
I'd like to just add, as being in that conversation before and having been told that I said something that was offensive, or the way I, you know, said it, and at that moment is jarring and it's very uncomfortable once again. But I'm just encouraging all my peers to process that. Okay. All right, I heard you, right? That active listening is like, whoa, I heard what you just said. I need to think about the way I'm communicating, or how I just said whatever I said. And then just, you know, everybody's looking for what actions, acknowledging active listening as an action, right? Because that's the action to acknowledging, embracing, empathizing somebody else's experience. It has nothing to do with my opinion. You know what I'm saying? Like, my opinion doesn't matter in somebody's real life experience.
Right.
So just taking that in.
And I think that Meghan brought up a very good point that is triggering to me, and apparently it's very triggering to the people in the comments right now. About the safe spaces. I know as a younger attorney who has some very strong feelings about several positions, so many times you've been afraid to have discussions about what is bothering you for fear of that performance evaluation, for fear of, are people going to think that I'm being the angry Black woman, or that I'm being the angry Black man? And so I think that one thing that I would like, well, several things that I would like all of the people who are actually viewing this to understand, more specifically the white people, because the Black people will understand exactly what I'm saying. We too many times walk on eggshells. And so, whereas we could have always had these conversations with you in the past, not when there is racial trauma on a cell phone, not when something big blows up in the news. We could always have these conversations. If you made me feel that I could have these conversations with you and not fear losing my job, not be viewed as the angry Black woman or angry Black man, or being someone who's not agreeable or trying to shake the table. And you can start this today, but understand that maybe you are having difficulty having these uncomfortable conversations with your Black counterparts is because we're afraid to talk about it. We're afraid to put ourselves out there and say, you know what, no, I don't feel valued. I'm angry. I'm angry that every time I turn on the news, another Black person is being killed. I'm angry about policy. I'm angry. You don't feel comfortable saying that. And I think a lot needs to be understood, that you have to have these conversations to where we're not just saying the generic thing. We're not just saying things that won't, and because we're thinking about not losing our jobs or making sure that we are making you feel safe in the office. Be open to the conversation. I've had some really good mentors in my life that have closed the door and have been like, just talk. Just tell me. I don't know. Just tell me. You're going to say some stuff that is going to hurt, but I want you to tell me. I think that if more white people made a safe environment to talk, these conversations could be a little bit easier. And I think it's also, Sidney, you're, not saying that you're old. So
I'll take it.
You're seasoned, mature.
Well, what I'm saying is because you have garnered a level of respect for yourself And to toot your horn, when anybody says the name Sidney Evering, they're just, oh, that's a good Black man. He's a good hard worker. But for these younger attorneys, that's myself, that are coming through, that are still trying to find their way and to find their niche, they want to speak out, but they don't have that person vouching from them that they are, oh, she's a good person, or she does this. And I wonder, Lee, have you encountered to where you see that there aren't you have friends, and maybe not friends because maybe you don't run in these circles, but maybe at work you see that people are not creating those safe spaces, and you can see how it would prohibit those type of conversations?
Personally, I have not experienced that so much, although definitely in the workplace you could see it. I think this is one of the actions that people in any sort of leadership or supervisory role can be mindful of and really implement, is creating that safe space. And, training other staff to do the same. And there's simple things of just asking, can we have this conversation? and accepting when somebody says no, and not being offended by that, right? So yeah, I think this is definitely a place that people in leadership roles can jump in and start making an impact.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important in terms of leadership, because I can imagine, as I was listening to you talk, Leslie, that there are probably some people that say, well, this, I don't want to talk about this type of stuff at work. This is a place of business. This is not the environment for that. And I just think that people who think like that are pretty naive or short-sighted to think that what goes on outside of the four walls of their organization doesn't impact their employees. And so I think it's incumbent upon leadership to kind of set that culture and to let their employees know that, look, I understand that there are things that go on outside of these walls that can have a tremendous impact on you. And I'm interested in your well-being and your emotional well-being. So let's, create an environment, a safe space where we can have these conversations.
It would really allow people to show up as their entire selves, which would be helpful. I think a lot of times from a business perspective, just kind of piggybacking off of what Sidney just said, from a business perspective, you may be missing out on talents that could be profitable because people are not showing themselves to you in their entirety, had they been made to feel like it was okay to do that. Just kind of listening to Sidney, he's been around, everybody knows him. He has a wonderful reputation, and I'm so happy that he has been out here fighting the good fight, particularly he's an attorney and he practices, but he definitely has been out here for quite some time working in D&I and diversity and inclusion work, which is helpful to have people in leadership that have reputations that will supersede you as a very junior person, because it's much harder when people don't know you, people don't have any type of rapport with you, they don't know your work, and then you come in, there's a problem, you've experienced a microaggression, or you've had a situation wherein someone was just outwardly racist to you. It's like, look, we ain't upsetting the apple cart. You know what I mean? It's a lot harder to do that when you don't have that experience there. And again, you have to balance that, is it worth it? Because you're going to experience racism in your life. You have to balance that out with, is this worth my livelihood? Do I want to take a check away from me and my family because I have to interact with this person who, is racist or is making inappropriate comments? So it's good to have leadership from the top down saying, this isn't the kind of thing that we are going to tolerate, and we're not fostering environments where people think that this is okay.
And I could say, when I was a young attorney, I had an experience where someone said something that was patently racist, and it blew me off my feet. it occurred at work and not at Parker Poe. I had to, I lost sleep that night about it. I literally could not sleep. I talked to my wife, talked to friends, and I was just so upset by it. And I didn't know how to handle it because I was a junior, a young attorney, but I decided that I couldn't let it go. And so, the next morning after I tried to calm myself down, I went and I spoke with that person, and we had a conversation. I'm not sure I got completely through to him. He apologized, appreciated that I came and spoke with him and didn't go speak to a superior, but still those are very real concerns that you have as a younger employee or younger associate, whatever your job position might be. And it's a very delicate balance, because like you said, Ben, you don't want to lose a paycheck. I had a family that I had to support. I didn't want to, and especially when you're Black, you have the stereotypes like you alluded to earlier, Leslie, of the, angry Black woman or the Black male, that you have to really kind of swallow your pride and swallow your emotions oftentimes. But I do think it's important that you do speak up. You need to do it in a collected way. You might want to seek some advice from a more seasoned person on how to approach it. Mm-hmm. But to sit there and swallow it without doing anything about it, I think is not doing anyone any good in the long run. And like you said, Meghan, there's not being able to be your genuine, authentic self, I think leads to a lot of retention issues in organizations with people of color.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was about to say something.
Well, I think that it's all very important, because what we're talking about now, again, this whole panel was created because of the atmosphere now, but it's good for the people who control these environments and the atmosphere of their, employment environments, to understand that this is how we've been feeling for a very, very long time. It's from how we can wear our hair, code switching, Black people know, and a few white people will know that code switching is when I have to go into the job and I need to talk like this because I don't want anyone to think that I'm ghetto and I'm not educated. When we're at home and we're like, hey, girl, we try to avoid being too Black. And so this is what contributes to, when it comes to a head, we're feeling tired of talking about it, because we've gone to diversity meetings and we've had the surveys and we've said, I don't feel valued. And then it comes to, you kind of realize, what? My Black face is bringing you money. Because if we just put it out there, your clients want to see people that look like me, but I don't want you to take those efforts because it's going to make you more money. You need to give me a seat at the table. If you gave me a seat at the table months ago, these conversations would be easier. You wouldn't have to worry about being offended because someone is now talking about something that makes you feel uncomfortable. So I think as I hear all of what we're saying, it's just kind of like, so going back, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. You need to do the work internally and do it. And once you do it internally, then you need to do it externally so that you're making a safe environment, so that when you need to have these discussions, you can have these discussions in a way that's beneficial to both parties. I think another thing that we need to talk about, and it's two big things, and I've seen some questions about this. People I didn't go out to the protest. And so does that, as a white person, because I didn't do the protest, did I not do enough? Or some people, you have friends that have these conversations in private, that will call somebody the N-word, or will talk about, oh Lord, here come this black girl again. Look at her hair. Like, she always changing her hair. I think those microaggressions, conversations like that contribute to these unsafe spaces. And I want to see from the panel, what do you personally think is, how do we avoid these microaggressions? Because again, it seems like the overarching theme is creating the safe space from the beginning so that we can have these conversations to where they are no longer uncomfortable. How do y'all think that we can do that? And I'll start with Lee.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I keep thinking about is really just going back to the self, and Meghan talked about being genuine as an employee or as a coworker, colleague, but being genuine as a white person in that conversation is as equally important, right? So, swallowing that pride, right? Acknowledging when you're wrong, taking next steps. All of those things include being vulnerable and allowing yourself to process and get there. So, things aren't going to just disappear overnight. That's, another thing I wanted to mention at some point is that, all of this is trending right now, and rightfully so. I mean, these are major issues, but acknowledging, like Sidney had said, these have been existing for as long as this country has. Right. So we can't expect also that overnight these, covert racism and ingrained kind of culture of oppression and racism will just disappear. So just preparing ourselves for that process and acknowledging that it won't be easy, and there's going to be a learning curve.
How about Sidney? What do you recommend?
Well, I mean, if a white person wants to know something they could do, like you alluded to someone saying, calling someone the N-word, or there goes that black girl changed her hair again. To me, those are opportunities where a white person can step forward, because to be honest,
definitely,
white people are probably more aware of racism than I am, because most times a person that's racist is not going to be overt enough to say something to my face, but they might say something behind my back. And if there's a white person there that could kind of nip that in the bud and say, look, that's not a cool thing to say, I'll call that person out, hold that person accountable, then you are doing your part. You're contributing to tearing down the systemic racism. To me, that is just as effective as marching on the State House. I mean, so we all have our spheres of influence that we could tap into to make changes. It doesn't have to be some big grandiose thing. It's one, kind of one step at a time. And so I would encourage folks, my white counterparts, to really call people out when they encounter racism.
Yeah, I want to second that and just emphasize. I mean, one thing I've very intentionally been doing, because I've been given this direction from Black peers and colleagues, is to have those conversations with white people specifically. And so I really do want to kind of underline and stress that the white community needs to do some self-reflection. And so it's on an individual level, but then as white peers, colleagues, whoever, doing that together and processing that together as well, and holding each other accountable.
Well, I guess that's the underlying theme, because as you all were speaking, and when Leslie asked the question, I wrote, hold people accountable with 3 exclamation points. And that's basically what we all will have to do. Be willing to hold people accountable. And in the event that people make microaggressions towards you and say things, call you the angry Black woman, hold them accountable. We know that it's a racist trope. It's an attempt to silence you. And so call them out on the carpet for that and let them know that, hey, I'm a part of this organization. I have value. I'm qualified to be here. And so tell me exactly what you mean by that. That said, Black people are entitled to all emotion, to include anger, just to put that out there. There has to be buy-in. You know, people have to buy into the idea that they want to be anti-racist. But at minimal, organizations should just make sure that they're fostering environments that say, hey, whatever goes on outside of the workplace, that can't happen here. You know, of course, I want people when they're in their homes to call people out. I do personally call out family members, friends, and the like. You know, I've had the pleasure of working, you know, and again, we've seen this with all types of folks that are minorities, religious minorities, the like. You know, I have had the pleasure of living in a Muslim community at one time and have heard things that were inappropriate and was willing to call people out on the carpet. So I think it's really important to be willing to say to folks, that's not okay. Those are my thoughts. Yeah.
And one of the questions that I'm seeing, and for those watching, please, I'm trying to ask your questions in combination with the questions that I've already asked, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat so that I can, you know, make sure that we ask it. But we've been approached by two questions, and I want to start with the first question just because it led off of what Meghan just talked about. It's about holding people accountable. I know some people are, how do you hold people accountable and still maintain those friendships? So if I am a white woman and there is somebody who in my office or at, you know, my gym that makes an inappropriate comment, like I call them out, do I not? Do we just stop being friends? Like, how do we, is there a way to retain a friendship with someone when you've already called them out? Like, Lee, have you had any of those conversations, and how are you dealing with those?
Yeah, it's tough, right? It gets really personal. A thought I have is that it's actually in those moments of disagreement that you should continue the conversation rather than depart, you know, rather than separating ways. I mean, maybe take a moment, take a breather, sleep on it or whatever. But, you know, it's those conversations that need to be happening. So I read something on social media recently that, because I see a lot of my friends actually doing this on social media, is if you're racist or if you say this, whatever, just delete me, right? Mm-hmm. But then you're ending that conversation, right? You just lost contact or communication with people that's who we need to be having the conversation with, right? And I can talk all day long with like-minded people and it feels good. Oh, it's awesome. I love it. We can talk till 3 o'clock in the morning, but it's those challenging ones where opinions are different that need to come to some sort of resolution and solution.
That's a very, very good point. And, you know, Meghan, you've already really answered the question. But Sidney, how do you have these uncomfortable, when it's not someone who's like, Sidney, hey man, I'm trying to figure out what's going on, because that's an easy conversation because you understand they want to talk. But how when you're like, you know what, I don't know what you're worried about anyway. I mean, it's not like it's happening to you, or, you know, I'm not racist, or something that's blatantly to where it's not a conversation that you're trying to engage, you're trying to learn, but you're being confrontational. How do you approach those conversations?
Just have them, you know, just really just have the conversation. And they may not always be easy, but I'm a lawyer. I'm up for a good debate. And you understand when you go into that you can say as much as you can to try to convince someone to change their perspective, but it may not ever change. And certain people are going to be who they are regardless. And you have to accept that kind of going in. But as long as you put forth your best effort to, you know, explain things from your perspective, that's really all you can do. Because ultimately this is a matter of the heart, right? I mean, you can't, you can give as good information as you want to give or as you possibly can give, but people will have to change their own hearts or have their own hearts changed. So you just have the conversation as best you can.
We have some educators in our group, and it brings up a really good point. A lot of what we're talking about, we're saying it in the mindset of, talking to adults. We all know that it starts at home.
Right.
And so for the educators, I've had a couple of questions about, how do they have these conversations with their students? How do they have these conversations in the context of the school? And I understand that that's not our wheelhouse. However, we do know that, it does start at home. And, Sidney, you were the director of diversity. And so you have some insight on what was working for the firm, but what is advice that can we give to people who are looking to touch people before they get to the part of having the uncomfortable conversation? Like, how can we get to the kids?
Yeah, that's the question that kind of hits home with me, because I have two children. I have two boys. I have a 16-year-old who's obviously a teenager, and then I have a 7, soon to be 8-year-old. So they see things from two very different perspectives. And my wife and I have had these conversations, particularly with my 16-year-old who just started driving, on how to handle himself if he's ever pulled over by law enforcement and all those type of things. So you for me, as a father of 2 Black boys, it's imperative that I have these conversations, and just kind of explain to them, look, this is not a perfect world. I mean, there are some people that will judge you based on the way you look, and you don't live down the stereotypes. You carry yourself in a dignified, respectable way, and you just try to be the best person that you can be. And if you do encounter these type of situations, you let us, as your parents, know, and let us try to handle it. You don't lash out physically or anything like that. But as far as an educator, my wife is in education, and educators have a huge responsibility, because they kind of shape the minds of, obviously are shaping the minds of our children in the future. So those are delicate but important conversations to have, and understand that children are oftentimes much more nuanced and understanding than we give them credit for, and they know what's going on. My son was in a class where his teacher, my youngest son was in a class where his teacher forbid them from talking about things like that. Well, they're having those conversations anyway, and so you're not there to guide them. Then they're liable to try to guide themselves for those who don't get it at home, and then all of these misconceptions and things can continue to manifest. So I think you have to take the time to try to shape the minds of children in a positive way, and not just think it's going to happen by fiat.
Leah or Meghan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. One thing. Go ahead,
please.
One thing that I keep on thinking in my head is the idea of modeling behavior, right? So kids learn from their environment and really are molded by what they see, right? And so it's not always just about having that conversation or saying racism is bad or this, but it's actually modeling that behavior in your life. So having, friends from different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses, showing like we are not different, we are humans, right? Encouraging them to make friends with people who they may not typically, and building, just those relationships to make it more of a human connection. Because again, we could say things all day long, but back to actions, right? And so I think modeling that lifestyle is really the best way to communicate that to children.
Meghan?
I don't think I can say it any better than the two of them. There are just a few items. I think in conversations, I think we need to encourage more parents. I'm sure many do, but more conversation with Black girls and the violence that is perpetuated towards them. We hear about the talk, and generally, it seems when people are talking about or having conversation about the talk, it is specific to Black boys. But increasingly, we have found that Black girls are experiencing similar or the same violence, particularly as it relates to the police. We've seen things like push out and some of the stats as it relates to pipeline to prison, as it relates to young Black girls. And so just to continue to emphasize and lift up that these things are happening to girls at staggering numbers too. And again, just to teach our children the realities that people are different, to model good behavior so that they will then to do the same thing, just like we said. But just be cognizant that, you know, there are things that they are going to face, and be open and honest with them when they come up.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and you know, I speak as a non-parent, but
Same.
I think that also you need to be reaching out to your schools and making sure that the education that is being taught to your children with regards to Black history and just how, you know, to see if they have their own diversity discussions that they have, because, you know, the kids are just sponges, and they will soak up what you tell them. And, you know, we've all seen the stories of inappropriate lesson plans being taught to children, and you're kind of like, well, how did that get through? And so I think as though, you know, I mean, I know parents have so much on their plates now, but if we're talking about ending certain, you know, biases, so we don't want our children to have to grow up and become adults and have implicit bias training, then we need to make sure and task it to the administration, because it maybe isn't just the teachers, that the administration knows that, you know, this is what we're wanting our children to learn, because I don't want to have to, you know, try to fix it when they're 20, 22. I think a lot of that needs to be fixed, you know, not only by modeled behavior, but what they're learning outside of the house. And, you know, I know we can't police our children on an everyday basis, but I think that we need to take a concerted effort. One of the questions that we had in the group is if we could give any opinions on or any examples of systematic racism that we think that allies or the wider public can do to actively work on now. So I know at the very beginning we were talking about performative actions, and I know there's not an exhaustive list that we could do, that we could tell people now. What pops into my mind personally before I lose the thought is that if you are in a position to create spaces for people who do not look like you and do not think like you, then you need to take the concerted effort to do so. If you know, and I'm just talking about in the job realm, but if you know that your firm or your business lacks diversity and you are aware of that, and you want to, you can't solve racism overnight, but you can solve it in your own backyard. And I think that's one of the ways that you look what's around you that can change that. Now that you know that there are several ways of being racist without being the KKK or going around here with hate crimes, that you make a concerted effort to be that person who speaks up so that the Black people don't have to feel like they're risking their jobs or their livelihoods to do so. Sidney, do you know any examples of systematic racism that our allies could possibly work to do away with now, if that even is something that you can do now?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but just to kind of dovetail on what we were talking about earlier, with juvenile justice, I think there's been there's systemic racism all through the juvenile justice system. And it kind of starts with the teachers that you were talking about, I think there's a dire need for implicit bias training with teachers, because the way they perceive particular young Black boys, they might perceive them as being more aggressive or being bad students. And so now we have these resource officers in schools, and it's just perpetuating this, the prison pipeline. And so there are many opportunities within the whole juvenile justice system to kind of tear down these the systemic racism, the way Black boys in particular are perceived, and the way the punishments are doled out and things of that nature. So if you have anyone that's working in that area, along with the school systems, I think there are a plethora of opportunities there for allyship.
I know we don't have much time left, but I'll just jump in real quick and try say this concisely. But remembering that this systematic racism, it trickles down to the individual. That's how deep rooted it is, right? So when we're talking about the education system and our children, one of my thoughts was, as parents, holding the school accountable is addressing the systematic racism in our education system.
Sure.
So standing up and being anti-racist is doing that on the forefront or front line. But donating, spending your money, in the Black economy and Black entrepreneurs. I mean, there's a lot of hard actions that you could do. Educate yourself about the people who are running for local office. It's those local leaderships who are actually going to directly impact your community. Voting, all of those things, petitions. So there's a lot of actions that can be taken, not just on that front line, but trying to hit those bigger targets as well.
I think the two that kind of resonated with me when you were asking the question, I just recently read a tweet about how Octavia Spencer said, this is what real allyship looks like. She's a Black actress, and her white counterpart basically tied their salaries together to bring up Octavia Spencer's salary, and she was like, this is true allyship. And what she said was, just in keeping with these are actions, they're actionable. What she said was, I don't know if this came at a cost to her. I don't know if she didn't get some of what she was initially going to get. So just sharing that. And then there was another, I testified regarding Black maternal health a while back now. And there was a white mother that testified, and she talked about the horrific experience, how horrific her birthing experience was. And she talked about, the stats as it related to Black maternal mortality. But she said, this must be awful because I'm a white woman. We have, plenty of resources. I have plenty of time off from work and insurance and all of these things. And if I was treated this way, I can't imagine how other people are being treated. Please provide these resources. Please approve this bill for funding because we really need it in this city. Again, that's just one thing that kind of lends itself to institutional racism as it relates to public health and healthcare. But she used kind of her privilege and was willing to speak on behalf of her experiences and what she knew was going on.
And I think that's very important. And we're running out of time. And I know that we didn't get all of your questions, but if you could continue to post them here. We are posting some resources that the panel has come up with, that if you were just looking for some more things to read that can get the gears going. Again, it's not all the answers. We couldn't provide you all the answers because, again, we're not experts. But I hope that you took from this panel that you have to have the uncomfortable conversations. Don't expect the Black people to want to willingly educate you all the time. There are people that are willing to have those conversations, but don't get offended if they don't want to have those conversations. Don't internalize or compare one plight against another plight. Do the work. The work is not done. The work can be whatever you think the work is, whether it's donating your time at the polls, whether it's, having a diversity committee created at your job, whether it's just reaching out to somebody to have these conversations. Whatever you do, make it meaningful and then keep it going, because the work is not done. We don't, any actions that you take, that start off as being actual authentic actions can turn to something being performative if it's something that you only do once and you don't do again. The diversity committee, if you are lawyers, we would of course want you to join in on the diversity committee. If you are not a lawyer but you are in the community, reach out to us the best way that you can, and we'll be, if you want us to come do a panel or, you know, a Zoom meeting or something, we will certainly do so, but we have to keep these conversations going. I want to thank the panelists for taking their time out in such stressful times to have some open dialogues about what we can do to create and foster some real change. But again, just know, y'all, this is just the beginning, and you know, we'll keep this fight going. You might see these faces again because somebody may have been in the comments and feel like that we need to start our own movie or something. I'm down, call me. But we thank you so much for joining in. Again, the resources will be posted on the South Carolina Bar page. The video will be available for you to go back and view it if you came in late. But again, thank you. And I think that the controller, Amber Hendricks, I'm not sure if she's going to cut me off. I'm not sure, but she is.
All right. So are we ready to wrap up?
Yes.
Can I share one final thought?
Oh, yeah, Sidney.
Go ahead.
So, you know, I think we shared a lot of good information, hopefully, with you all today. But for me personally, I just ask that you not get caught up in all the semantics, whether, you know, it's allyship, all of racism, anti-racist. For me, ultimately, like I said earlier, this is a matter of the heart. And a very wise person once said, "Do unto others as you have them do unto you." And I think that's really encapsulates it. That's the gist. We just treat each other the way we want to be treated. I think all of this can go away overnight.
All right. Well, thanks for those parting words from Sidney. I'm so glad you all tuned in today. Thank you to all the panelists and Leslie for conducting this conversation and for helping to bring my vision to life. And once again, thanks to the South Carolina Bar's Diversity Committee. And everyone, have a good night.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Bye.